Welcome to Chapter 1, Speaking in Public. Before we get started with the material, I just want to kind of go ahead and take a look at some things that you need to be thinking about and preparing for, both for the test we will take over these chapters as well as the comprehensive final at the end. So up first, let's take a look at those chapter reminders. First, make sure you take notes. This will become your study guide. Second, read the chapter. Familiarize yourself with the material, both what's the primary text and all the examples that are provided. Third, make sure that you're able to define and apply the key terms in the chapter. Fourth, make sure that you're able to answer the questions at the end of each chapter upon the completion of your reading. So as we go through the material ahead, please make sure that once again you are taking notes in whatever style and fashion and form makes most sense to you, whether that's on paper, whether that's on a Google Doc, whatever that happens to be. Ultimately, the choice is yours, as this will be drafting of your study guide for both the test and the comprehensive final at the end of the semester. So up first, let's take a look at public speaking and conversation. Both public speaking and conversation are going to have some similarities and have some differences. So we'll start by looking at how they're similar. First is that logically organized thoughts are going to make up our conversation and public speaking. We have to have some direction that we want to go and some content to support the message that we're trying to get across. We're also going to tailor the message to the audience. Just think about how you would explain to a young child how to tie their shoe. Would be different than if you tried to explain it to an adult. A lot of times with both public speaking and conversation, we will add stories to maximize the impact of the conversation or the speech that we're given. And finally, we have feedback adapted to. Many times this has to do with in the formal setting with public speaking. If we're telling jokes or we're trying to provide some additional insight and it's just not being received well by the audience, we might skip over those future examples. As well as, especially when you're having those conversations, a lot of times you're listening so that you can then respond. So you're adapting to what the other person is saying. So just as public speaking and conversation are similar, they differ as well. So when we look at the differences between public speaking and conversation, I like to view the public speaking as the formal side of things. So when you think of dancers, you're very formal, you're very proper, and how you dress, how you act, those kind of things. And conversation is more kind of the hanging out, if you will, the very informal. So the differences between the two. First, we'll take a look at how public speaking is more highly structured. With public speaking, you're going to have some sort of formal outline that you create. A lot of times this outline is going to include research as well as additional visual aids to support what is being said. Public speaking also requires more formal language. A lot of times we're going to see this come across in technical terms, especially when we're doing informative topics. It could also be procedural based if we're doing demonstration speeches, or it could also be very technical in the sense of persuasion. These are the steps that you need to accomplish. And then finally, public speaking requires a different method of delivery. A lot of times in public speaking being formal, you're standing behind a podium and addressing an audience, where conversation is very informal, to where you might be talking in a small group or on a one-on-one session. For many, public speaking is not the first course or class that they want to take, and that's because of the idea of stage fright. Many times, people are more afraid of what they're going to sound like, look like, or act like in front of an audience than they are actually about their knowledge level of the topic. So when we look at stage fright, it's just simply the anxiety over the prospect of speaking in front of an audience. So a lot of times with anxiety, and the stage fright. It's how we build ourselves up to that situation. If we feel like we're going to do poorly, then in a lot of cases our presentation might come across that way. But if we think about positively and being positive in our presentations, we'll have more success. So some ways to think about reducing speech anxiety, and we'll start with this slide and then on to the next as well, is first and foremost acquire experience. Think about ways that you can gain opportunities to speak in front of groups and constantly increase the size of those groups as you become more comfortable. So speaking in front of one person, then two, then three. Always prepare, prepare, prepare. Make sure you have enough content, information, and especially visuals so that you can engage your audience. As we mentioned before, always think positive. The more positive you can be about your presentation, the better your speech will come across. Continuing on to our second slide about reducing speech anxiety, use the power of visualization. See yourself being successful. And know that most nervousness is not visible to the audience. Yes, they might notice some shaking or hand jitters, but everything else that's going on in your mind is truly that going on in your mind and not to be seen or experienced by the audience. And finally, don't expect perfection. Extending beyond the reducing speech anxiety, we kind of hit on this just a little bit ago, but positive nervousness is where we have controlled nervousness that energizes the speaker for the presentation. So when you're thinking about your presentation, and if you're nervous, don't let the nervousness become distractive to yourself or the audience, but use it as kind of an energy point to move forward and be successful. We also mentioned talking about visualization and visualizing yourself being successful. So when we look at visualization, it's just simply that of picturing yourself giving a successful presentation. When you see yourself being successful, your presentation comes across successful, simply through your confidence and your preparation. The next thing that we want to take a look at is the idea of critical thinking when it comes to public speaking. When we think about critical thinking, it's important to make sure that we look critically at the presentation we're about to make, whether that's with the topic, how we structure our main point, or the support material that we use. So with critical thinking, it's going to allow us to be focused and organized in our preparation. We also need to think about the relationships among the ideas, the soundness of evidence that we use, and the difference between fact and opinion. Especially when we look at that last portion there with fact versus opinion, a lot of our speeches, especially in the persuasive realm, we're going to be looking for expert testimony to support the topic and the position that we're taking. It's one thing for you to give your opinion, give your viewpoint, but it has a lot more impact with your audience when what you are saying is supported by recognized experts within their field. So now we're going to take a look at the speech communication process. And when we look at the speech communication process, we have to think of this as very circular or secular. So we'll take a look at a graphic here in just a second of what that's going to look like. But we want to talk about the different aspects of the speech communication process. So the speech communication process typically starts with the speaker, the person who has information and wants to relay it to the listener. That information that they have within their presentation or within themselves becomes the message. So when the speech is over, The audience should be able to say, this was the topic, and these were the key points that I gleaned away. The channel is going to be how the speaker presents the message to the listener. And when we look at those channels, it can be face-to-face. It can be in a formal setting behind the podium to an audience. It could be a video such as this that you're watching. Could be a Zoom session, anything along those lines. That is the channel for which the message is being delivered to the audience or the listener from the speaker. As the speaker is making their presentation, they're going to be looking for feedback. They're going to see, how is the audience taking in the information? Am I going too slow? Am I going too fast? Am I too technical? Or am I not technical enough in what I'm saying? Additionally, with modern society, we have a lot of interference with what's going on. And when we think about interference, it's things both physical and mental with our audience and our listeners. One of the biggest interferences that we face today are cell phones and technology. It's great that we have a laptop or Chromebook in front of us, but it's very quick to get distracted or sidetracked every time a message comes up or a notification. And then finally, we have situation. Situation can hold a lot of impact and power on the presentation. You have a more captive, interested audience when the seminar or presentation is something that the audience signed up for, the listener signed up for, versus a mandatory training. And we've all gone through those at some point in our lives, where it's not the most ideal situation, but we kind of stick through it. So as we talked about the speech communication process, I mentioned before it's very secular, and we'll take a look here on this next slide about the actual process. So we have our speaker on the left and our audience member on the right, and you can kind of see how that breaks down visually. So our speaker on the left, she has a message that she wants to get to her partner on the right. As he is receiving that message, he's going to provide some sort of feedback, whether it's a confused look on his face, nodding in agreement, those kind of things. Then we have through the middle there is some sort of channel. How is this occurring? Face-to-face, over Zoom, via video conference, whatever that happens to be. You see the white box there is just the interference we talked about, for instance, cell phones and digital devices, those kind of things. And then finally, all-encompassing is a situation. What is bringing the speaker to the listener? So as a speaker, we need to remember that everybody within our audience, and even ourselves, have what we consider a frame of reference. And the frame of reference is the sum of the person's knowledge, experience, goals, values, and attitudes. Everybody's frame of reference is different. Even identical twins have different frames of reference. So think about your frames of reference and how you look at things that are good and how things are bad. The easiest way is to think about what your favorite band or genre of music is. It probably greatly differs than that of your parents, maybe even of your siblings, and definitely within your friend group. With the frame of reference, everything is filtered through the listener's frame of reference. And like I mentioned before, no two people have the same frame of reference. So as we're preparing our speech, we need to make sure that we understand our audience so that we can modify and adjust our topic to ensure that what we're presenting upon is actually going to make a connection with our audience. But to do so, we need to understand the frame of reference from which we are presenting and the audience is receiving. When we think about frame of reference, sometimes people's personal beliefs can overtake the presentation. So this happens, and it brings us to enthocentrism. And this is just simply where one believes their group or culture is superior to all other groups or cultures. So we just have to make sure that when we are presenting, that we kind of eliminate as much bias in our presentation as possible, and also be conscious that our listeners and audience might not necessarily share the same experiences, cultural upbringing, or experience. So some ways to avoid enthocentrism, and we'll start with this slide and then we'll transition to the next to complete our list. But first is respect the listener's cultural values. Adapt the message to the expectations and imagine oneself in the place of the listener. It's really important to make sure that if we are not of the group or cannot align to the group for which we are presenting, that we are careful in how we approach our topic and our materials to not alienate or lack connection with our audience. Be alert for feedback, and listeners also have to avoid ethnocentrism. Just because as a listener we might not relate directly to the presenter or the speaker, we do need to empathize with them and understand where they're coming from and their perspective on the particular topic or information that they are relying to the audience. So that is going to go ahead and conclude us for Chapter 1, Speaking in Public. I do want to wrap up by going over our reminders again. Hopefully through this presentation you were taking notes. Feel free to go back and replay as slow as you need on those slides. You don't have to take everything down word for word, but you definitely want to make sure you have enough information to be successful on the test and the final. Ensure that you're reading the chapter. Those are posted to Google Classroom. Be able to define and apply the key terms in the chapter. It's not just knowing the definition, but it's understanding how the definition can be used and the term can be used in application. And finally, be able to answer the questions at the end of each chapter. So thanks for viewing Chapter 1. And if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know.